The earth hung in the void like a wounded animal, its once bright blue now shrouded by the gray haze of despair. From the observation deck of the orbital station, Cale Oren stood motionless, his silhouette a dark blade against the faint glow of the planet below. His breath fogged the chilled glass as he stared down at the fractured world, a world forsaken by the galaxy it had once trusted. The silence in the room was suffocating, punctuated only by the faint hum of the station's life support systems. It was a sound Cale had grown to hate, a constant reminder of how far humanity had fallen. "They left us to rot." Aaron Tal's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and cold. The tactician leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed, his piercing gaze fixed on Cale. "The Council exiled us here, knowing full well we'd never survive without their precious technology. And yet, you want to talk about hope?" Cale's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He turned from the window, his boots thudding softly against the metal floor. Aaron was right. Survival was a cruel joke on the edge of the galaxy. Earth's orbital defenses had been stripped, its people left to scavenge scraps of outdated tech, all while the Galactic Alliance pretended humanity no longer existed. "I don't care about their intentions," Cale said finally, his voice a low growl. "Let them think we're broken. Let them think we're done. But we are not done, Aaron. Not yet." Aaron shook his head, his face a mask of skepticism. "Bold words, Captain. But bold words won't keep the Horde from devouring us when they come. And they will come." "Then we'll be ready," Cale snapped. His gray eyes burned with a fierce determination, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. "Earth has been underestimated before. They called us savages when we joined the Alliance, remember? They thought we couldn't contribute anything of value, and now they think they've erased us. I intend to prove them wrong." Behind them, the doors hissed open, and Lyra Vashti entered, her presence as sharp as the scent of ozone after a lightning strike. The diplomat-turned-spy master moved with a quiet grace, her sharp green eyes taking in the tension between the two men. "I've intercepted a transmission," she said, handing Cale a sleek datapad. Her voice carried the weight of 1,000 secrets, each one carefully buried behind her composed exterior. "The Horde hit the Andrua system. It wasn't just an attack, it was a massacre." Cale's fingers tightened around the datapad as he scanned the report. Images of charred cities and skeletal remains flashed across the screen, accompanied by fragmented audio of desperate cries. The Eclipser Horde was like a nightmare come to life. Massive biomechanical ships that moved like predators, consuming everything in their path. "This isn't random," Lyra continued, her tone measured. "The Horde doesn't just destroy, they obliterate. And yet, the Council hasn't mobilized. No reinforcements, no fleets, nothing." Aaron let out a bitter laugh. "Of course they haven't. The Alliance is too busy protecting their core worlds. The rest of us? Expendable." Cale set the datapad down, his mind racing. The Horde wasn't just a threat, it was a reckoning. And Earth, crippled and isolated, was in its crosshairs. "We can't wait for them to come to us," Cale said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. "We need to act. Lyra, how much of their tech can we reverse engineer?" Lyra hesitated, her usually unshakable confidence faltering. "Rin's team has made progress, but it's slow. We're working with scraps, Cale. The Council made sure of that when they confiscated everything we had. It's a miracle we've gotten this far." "Then we'll work with what we have," Cale said firmly. "I don't care if it's scraps or dust. We'll build something stronger, something they can't ignore." The room fell silent again, the weight of Cale's words pressing down like a storm front. Aaron shifted uncomfortably, his skepticism warring with the faint glimmer of hope in Cale's determination. Lyra watched Cale with an intensity that bordered on scrutiny, as if trying to decipher the man behind the bravado. Finally, Aaron sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "You're serious about this, aren't you? You actually think we can take on the Horde?" Cale stepped closer, his gaze locking onto Aaron's. "I don't just think it, Aaron. I know it. Humanity has always thrived under pressure. When the Council stripped us of everything, they didn't break us. They sharpened us. And now it's time to show them what they created." Aaron didn't reply, but the hard set of his jaw softened. Just a fraction. Lyra, too, seemed to stand a little taller, her usual air of detachment replaced by a flicker of resolve. The hum of the station grew louder, as if echoing the renewed energy in the room. Cale turned back to the window, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon of space. Somewhere out there, the Eclipser Horde was waiting, an unstoppable force poised to consume everything in its path. But Earth would not be consumed. Not this time. Cale's voice broke the silence, quiet but unyielding. "We may be exiled, but we are not defeated. We'll build the strongest fleet this galaxy has ever seen. And when the time comes, we won't just survive. We'll make them remember why they should never have underestimated us." Behind him, Aaron and Lyra exchanged a glance, their unspoken doubts tempered by the weight of Cale's conviction. They didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead was paved with uncertainty. But for the first time in years, there was something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And in the cold expanse of space, hope was a weapon more powerful than any fleet. The command center buzzed with tense energy, the air thick with the sharp tang of solder and the low, rhythmic hum of prototype reactors. Technicians darted between workstations, their faces etched with a mix of exhaustion and determination. Overhead, the flickering lights betrayed the fragility of Earth's orbital station, a makeshift cradle for humanity's improbable resurgence. Cale Oren paced along the central walkway, his boots echoing off the grated floor. His eyes, sharp and restless, scanned the chaotic scene below. He felt the weight of their desperation in the clamor of tools against metal, the acrid smell of burnt circuits, and the occasional bark of frustrated engineers. Every sound was a reminder of how precarious their position was. A single misstep, a single failure, and humanity's last embers could be snuffed out. At the far end of the room, Rin Kate stood hunched over a half-dismantled alien thruster, his grease-streaked hands flying across the exposed circuitry. The engineer muttered under his breath, his words a mixture of curses and prayers. Sparks flew as he wielded a plasma torch, the heat searing his gloved fingers. Rin worked like a man possessed, his focus unyielding despite the chaos around him. Cale approached, his voice cutting through the noise. "Rin, how close are we?" Rin didn't look up. "Close is a relative term, Captain. If you mean close, as in we'll have a functional ship by tomorrow, then no. If you mean close, as in this thruster won't explode the next time someone breathes near it, then maybe." Kyle allowed himself a wry smile. "I'll take maybe over no." Rin finally glanced up, his brown eyes rimmed with dark circles. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days, and Cale suspected that wasn't far from the truth. "Cale, this isn't a matter of stubbornness or ingenuity. We're reverse engineering tech that wasn't meant for us, working with tools that belong in a scrapyard. Every time we fix one problem, 10 more show up." Kyle stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I don't need perfection, Rin. I need progress. I need something, anything, that shows we're not just sitting here waiting to die." Rin hesitated, his gaze dropping to the thruster. The silence stretched, broken only by the hiss of coolant lines and the distant rumble of a testing reactor. Finally he exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "Fine. You'll get something. But if it blows up, don't say I didn't warn you." Cale clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm. "That's all I ask." Across the room, Lyra Vashti entered, her movements precise and purposeful. Her sharp eyes swept over the command center, taking in every detail with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime observing and calculating. She carried a datapad tucked under her arm, the glow of its screen casting faint shadows across her angular features. She reached Cale just as a muffled explosion reverberated through the station, sending a shudder through the floor. A haze of smoke billowed from a nearby workstation, accompanied by a stream of curses from a young technician. "Productive as always, I see," Lyra remarked dryly, handing the datapad to Cale. "You'll want to see this." Cale scanned the report, his expression darkening. "Another sabotage attempt?" Third one this week, Lyra confirmed, her voice taut. Whoever's behind it knows how to stay hidden. No direct evidence, no mistakes. But they're getting bolder. Cale's grip on the datapad tightened. Do we know what they're after? Lyra hesitated, her tone softening. It's not just sabotage, Kyle. They're targeting key systems, power cores, navigation arrays. If this continues, we won't have a fleet to fight with. Kyle's frustration simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. He closed his eyes, taking a slow, measured breath. Do whatever it takes to find them, Lyra. I don't care if you have to turn this station inside out. She nodded, her expression unreadable. I've already started, but Kale, you need to prepare for the possibility that it's someone close to us. The words hung in the air like a blade poised to strike. Kale met her gaze, his jaw tightening. I know. Before Lyra could respond, the station's alarms blared, their shrill wail cutting through the noise. The room froze, every head snapping toward the main display screen as it lit up with a flood of red markers. Captain, a comms officer called out, his voice trembling. We've got incoming. An unidentified Alliance patrol ship, closing fast. Cale's pulse quickened. The Alliance rarely ventured this far from their core worlds, and when they did, it was never a good sign. He turned to Aaron, who had materialized at his side like a shadow. Status? Cale demanded. Aaron's fingers danced across the console, his expression grim. They're armed, but they haven't locked weapons yet. Could be a reconnaissance mission, or... He trailed off, leaving the implication unsaid. Or they've found out what we're building, Cale finished, his voice edged with steel. We can't let them report back. Aaron's mouth twitched in a faint smile. Finally, something we agree on. Cale turned to the room, his voice rising above the blaring alarms. Battle stations! Scramble every operational ship we've got. I don't care if it's held together with duct tape. Get it in the air. The command center erupted into motion, the hum of activity escalating into a frantic roar. Technicians shouted orders, consoles beeped in rapid succession, and the station trembled as hangar doors opened. Kyle felt the adrenaline surge through his veins, sharpening his focus. As he donned his command headset, a thought lingered in the back of his mind, a whisper of doubt, a question he dared not voice. Could their patchwork fleet stand against the might of an Alliance patrol? Or were they about to face the cold reality of their own inadequacy? The first ship launched, a sleek, heavily modified frigate with mismatched plating and a barely functional reactor. Kyle watched its thrusters flare as it disappeared into the void, followed by 3 more equally cobbled-together vessels. Lyra's voice crackled through the comms. The patrol ship is hailing us. They're demanding we surrender and prepare for inspection. Cale's lips curled into a grim smile. Tell them we don't take orders anymore. The frigates engaged the patrol ship moments later, their weapons lighting up the darkness like distant stars. Cale watched the battle unfold from the command center, his heart pounding with every impact and explosion. The station shuddered as debris slammed into its shields, the vibrations rattling through his bones. Aaron's voice came through the comms, calm and measured despite the chaos. They're holding, Captain, barely. But we've got a weak spot in their aft shields. If we can exploit it, do it, Cale interrupted. Take them out. The frigates surged forward, their movements coordinated and precise. Plasma fires streaked through the void, striking the patrol ship's exposed flank. A moment later, the ship erupted in a blinding explosion, the shockwave rippling outward like a tidal wave. Cheers erupted in the command center, but Kyle felt no relief. He stared at the wreckage on the screen, his expression hard. This victory, small as it was a warning. The Alliance wouldn't ignore them for long. We've drawn blood, Lyra said quietly, standing beside him. They'll come for us now. Cale nodded, his gaze unwavering. Then we'll be ready. The silence of the research station was suffocating, an eerie stillness that wrapped around the fleet like a predator waiting to strike. Cale Oren stood on the bridge of the Vanguard, his gaze fixed on the station looming in the darkness ahead. The faint glow of dying emergency lights flickered across its surface, casting long shadows over its jagged edges. It looked less like a facility and more like a carcass, abandoned in the void. They called this a research station? Rinkate's voice crackled through the comms. He sounded as if he didn't believe his own words. More like a tomb. Kale glanced at Lyra Vashti, who stood to his left, her expression unreadable. The datapad in her hands displayed fragmented logs recovered from the station's automated systems, encrypted files that hinted at experiments gone horribly wrong. She tapped her fingers against the screen, a nervous rhythm that betrayed her otherwise calm demeanor. "Doesn't add up," Lyra murmured. "This station was decommissioned years ago. Officially, it was a medical outpost, but these schematics—" She held the datapad toward Kale. "Don't match the story." Kale scanned the images, his brow furrowing. The blueprints detailed extensive subterranean levels, far more than would be needed for a medical facility. Hidden within those depths, marked only by cryptic symbols, was a chamber labeled Project Eclipser. "This is where it started," Kale said, his voice low and grim. "The Horde. It wasn't an accident." Lyra nodded, her green eyes flickering with unease. "If these logs are accurate, the Council didn't just know about the Horde. They created it." Kale's grip on the datapad tightened, the plastic creaking under the pressure. He wanted to believe it wasn't true, that even the Galactic Alliance wouldn't be so reckless. But deep down, he knew better. The Alliance had always been more concerned with control than consequence. "Captain," Arental's voice broke through the tension, sharp and urgent. "We're picking up movement inside the station. No life signs, but something's active down there." Kale turned to the main display where a grainy feed from one of the station's external cameras showed a faint pulsing light emanating from the lower levels. It pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and unrelenting, as if the station itself were alive. "Rin, get a team ready," Kale ordered. "We're going in." The Vanguard's docking arms latched onto the station with a metallic groan, sending vibrations rippling through the hull. Kale led the boarding team, his pulse hammering in his ears as they descended into the darkened corridors of the station. The air was stale and metallic, laced with the faint stench of decay. Every step echoed like a gunshot, the sound amplified by the oppressive silence. Rin moved ahead, his scanner emitting soft beeps as he swept the area. "Radiation levels are spiking," he muttered. "Something's been powering up recently. Could be the station's reactor, or something worse." "Define worse," Aaron said dryly, his weapon at the ready. "Let's not find out," Lyra interjected, her voice clipped. She kept close to Kale, her every movement precise and calculated. Despite the tension, there was a calmness about her, a steady resolve that seemed to anchor the team. They reached a massive blast door, its surface scarred and blackened. The faint hum of energy radiated from its edges, and the pulsing light from earlier seeped through the cracks. Rin crouched beside the control panel, his fingers flying across the rusted interface. "This door wasn't meant to open again," he muttered. "Which makes me really curious why it's trying to power itself up now." "Less curiosity, more opening," Aaron said, glancing over his shoulder. "I don't like standing still in a place like this." The blast door hissed and groaned as it slid open, revealing a cavernous chamber bathed in an unsettling red glow. The air was thick and humid, carrying the acrid tang of burned flesh and ozone. In the center of the room, suspended within a crystalline containment field, was a massive, pulsating mass of biomechanical tendrils. It looked like a grotesque heart, its surface glistening with a sickly sheen as it throbbed in time with the pulsing light. "What in the stars?" Rin whispered, his voice trailing off. Kale stepped forward, his hand tightening around his weapon. "Is that—" "The core of the Horde," Lyra finished, her voice trembling. "This is where it was born." Before anyone could respond, the containment field flickered, and a deep guttural growl resonated through the chamber. The mass shuddered violently, its tendrils lashing out against the walls. The lights dimmed, and a chilling wind swept through the room, carrying with it whispers that seemed to crawl into their minds. "Captain, we need to leave," Aaron said, his voice sharp. "Now!" The whispers grew louder, forming words in a language Kale didn't understand but felt in his very bones. The chamber seemed to warp, the walls shifting and twisting as if alive. Kyle forced himself to move, his voice cutting through the growing chaos. "Fall back! Now!" The team retreated, their footsteps pounding against the floor as the chamber trembled behind them. Alarms blared, a deafening cacophony that drowned out the whispers, but not the overwhelming sense of dread. As they reached the docking bay, a low rumble shook the station, and the mass of tendrils burst free from its containment. Kyle barely made it onto the Vanguard before the docking arms released, sending the ship hurtling away from the station. On the main display, the station convulsed, its structure buckling as the mass expanded outward, consuming everything in its path. "Captain, we've got a problem," Aaron said from his console, his voice tight. "That thing's emitting a signal, a distress beacon. Every Horde ship in the sector is going to hear it." Kyle's mind raced. The station hadn't been a tomb. It had been a trap, and now the trap was sprung. "Rin, can we jam the signal?" Kyle asked. Rin shook his head, his face pale. "Not a chance. It's using frequencies we don't even understand." Kale clenched his fists, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger and frustration. The Alliance hadn't just created the Horde, they had unleashed it, and now it was humanity's problem to clean up their mess. "Lyra," Kale said, his voice steady despite the chaos, "get me everything we've got on Alliance facilities in this sector. If they've got more of these things out there, we need to find them before it's too late." Lyra nodded, her fingers already flying across her datapad. "I'll get you what you need." As the Vanguard sped away from the station, Kale turned to the viewing port, watching as the station was consumed by a wave of writhing tendrils. The light from the mast dimmed, and in its place, a new, darker glow began to spread, a glow that promised destruction on a scale Kale couldn't yet comprehend. "Captain," Aaron said quietly, "this changes everything." Kale nodded, his gaze fixed on the growing threat. "No," he said, his voice low and resolute. "This just confirms what we already knew. The Alliance doesn't deserve to lead this galaxy, and if they won't fix their mistakes, we will." The crew exchanged glances, their determination solidifying in the face of the unknown. Kale turned away from the viewport, his mind already racing with plans. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was war, and humanity would not be the ones to fall. The Vanguard cut through the void, its engines humming with an almost defiant energy as it fled the ruins of the research station. Kale Oren stood at the center of the command deck, his gaze locked on the tactical display flickering before him. The holographic map showed a growing cluster of red blips, Horde ships converging on their position like a pack of wolves scenting blood. The air was thick with tension, the low buzz of the consoles punctuated by sharp bursts of activity from the crew. The scent of burned circuitry mingled with the faint tang of sweat and metal, creating a sensory reminder of just how much pressure they were under. Kale's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the console, his mind racing through possibilities. "We're out of time, Captain," Aaron Tal said, his voice as sharp as the glint in his eyes. The tactician stood to Kale's right, his posture rigid as he analyzed the incoming data. "We can't outrun them, not with their numbers, and if they box us in—" "They won't," Kale said, his tone clipped. "We won't let them." "How?" Lyra Vashti interjected, her voice cutting through the rising tension. She leaned against a console, her green eyes narrowing as she studied Kyle. "We can't fight them head-on, not with this fleet. We need a plan, one that doesn't end with all of us as debris." Kyle straightened, his shoulders squaring as he turned to face his crew. "We don't have the firepower for a direct confrontation, but we have something they don't: ingenuity. If we're going to survive this, we need to use their strength against them." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Kale's words sinking in. The tension was palpable, an almost electric charge that prickled the skin and quickened the pulse. Kale took a step forward, his voice steady and commanding. "Rin," he said, turning to the engineer, "how much power can we siphon from the reactor without compromising the ship?" Rin frowned, rubbing a hand over the stubble on his jaw. "Depends on what you're planning. If you're thinking about overloading something, we could manage a controlled pulse, but it'd drain our reserves fast. Kale nodded. Good. We'll use that. I want you to rig the reactor to emit an EMP burst strong enough to disable their systems temporarily. We'll need to time it perfectly to catch them in the net. Aaron's brow furrowed. An EMP won't stop the Horde for long. Their ships can recover faster than ours. That's why it's not the only part of the plan, Kale said, his voice firm. Lyra, I need you to find us an ambush point, somewhere we can funnel them into a narrow corridor. If we can isolate their fleet, we can deal with them in smaller waves. Lyra tapped rapidly on her datapad, her expression a mask of concentration. There's a debris field 2 clicks from here, a graveyard from one of the old Alliance wars. The field is dense, full of derelict ships and unstable wreckage. Perfect for an ambush. Kale's lips curved into a grim smile. Perfect. Aaron, once we're in position, I want you to coordinate our remaining frigates. Use the debris to your advantage. Force the Horde into choke points where we can pick them off one by one. Aaron gave a sharp nod. Understood. Kale turned back to the holographic display, his gaze intense. This isn't just about survival. This is our chance to strike back, to show the Horde and the Alliance that humanity won't be hunted. Not anymore. The room fell silent, the weight of Kale's words settling over the crew like a shroud. They all understood the stakes, the razor-thin line they were walking. But beneath the fear and uncertainty there was something else, a spark of determination, kindled by Kale's unyielding resolve. Let's move, Kale ordered. The crew sprang into action, their movements precise and focused. The hum of the ship's systems grew louder as Rin began recalibrating the reactor, his hands flying over the controls with practiced efficiency. The scent of ozone filled the air as circuits sparked and wires hissed under the strain. Lyra worked beside him, feeding coordinates to the navigation console. Her fingers tapped out a steady rhythm, her green eyes flickering with the glow of the screen. We'll be cutting it close, she said, her voice low. The Horde will be on us before we reach the debris field. We just need enough time to set the trap, Kale replied, and if they get too close, we'll give them something to chase. The Vanguard veered toward the debris field, its engines burning hot as it pushed to outpace the pursuing Horde. The shattered remnants of ancient battles loomed ahead, a twisted labyrinth of metal and destruction. Kyle felt a pang of unease as they entered the field, the wreckage casting long shadows across the ship's hull. Navigation is going to be a nightmare, Rin muttered, his voice laced with frustration. One wrong move, and we're scrap. Then don't make a wrong move, Aaron said dryly, his eyes glued to the tactical display. Kyle ignored the exchange, his focus laser-sharp. The red blips on the display grew closer, their movements relentless and precise. He could almost feel the cold, mechanical hunger of the Horde bearing down on them, a predator closing in on its prey. EMP charge ready, Rin announced, his voice tight with tension. But once we fire it, we'll be dead in the water for at least 30 seconds. That's all we'll need, Kale said. He turned to Lyra. Are they funneled? Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. Right where we want them. Then let's spring the trap, Kale said, his voice hard. Rin, fire the EMP. The reactor surged, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through Kale's very bones. A burst of energy rippled outward, lighting up the debris field in a dazzling wave of blue light. The Horde ships shuddered, their movements faltering as their systems went offline. Now, Aaron! Kale barked. The frigates moved with lethal precision, weaving through the wreckage to strike the disabled Horde ships. Plasma bolts lit up the darkness, their brilliant flashes illuminating the twisted remains of the battlefield. The scent of burning metal filled the air, sharp and acrid, as the frigates unleashed a relentless assault. Kyle watched the display, his heart pounding as the red blips began to disappear one by one. But even as the Horde ships fell, his unease grew. Something wasn't right. Lyra, he said, his voice low, what's their rear formation look like? Lyra's fingers flew across the console, her expression darkening. They're holding back. A second wave is waiting just outside the field. Kale's stomach tightened. The Horde wasn't retreating. They were regrouping. "Aaron," Kale said sharply, "pull the frigates back, now." Before Aaron could respond, the second wave of Horde ships surged into the field, their movements faster and more coordinated than the first. The Vanguard shuddered under the impact of a direct hit, alarms blaring as the lights flickered. "Shields are failing!" Rin shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Kale gritted his teeth, his mind racing. They were out of time, out of options. But he wasn't about to give up. Not now, not ever. "Lyra," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos, "get me a direct line to the fleet. I have an idea." As Lyra worked, Kale's gaze fixed on the display. This wasn't just a battle, it was a test, and humanity wasn't finished yet. The Vanguard trembled violently, the deck beneath Kale Oren's feet shuddering with each hit. Sparks cascaded from overloaded consoles, and the acrid stench of scorched wiring filled the air. The Horde's second wave was relentless, tearing through the debris field with a ferocity that left no room for error. Kale stood firm at the center of the chaos, his eyes locked on the tactical display. He was out of time, out of options, except one. "Aaron!" Kale barked over the cacophony, his voice steady. "Pull every frigate back to defensive formation around the Vanguard. I don't care what's left of their engines. Get them here, now." Aaron's face was a mask of focus as he relayed the orders. "They'll never make it through the field intact," he said, his voice sharp. "The Horde's closing too fast." "They'll make it," Kyle said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "We don't have another choice." Lyra Vashti approached, her usually unshakable demeanor fraying at the edges. Her hair clung to her damp forehead, and her green eyes burned with urgency. "Kyle, the Horde's rear wave is shifting. They're repositioning, adapting. Whatever we're planning, we need to act now." Kyle turned to her, his jaw tight. "Then it's time to show them what we're capable of. Lyra, get me a direct line to the fleet, all channels." Lyra hesitated, her gaze searching his face. "What are you going to do?" "What we should have done from the beginning," Kyle said, his voice low. "Make them remember who we are." The faintest flicker of a smile crossed her lips, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She nodded and moved to her station, her fingers flying over the console. A moment later, her voice rang out. "You're live." Kyle squared his shoulders, his gaze sweeping over the bridge crew. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, fear, and defiance, the same emotions that churned in his chest. He took a steadying breath and began. "This is Captain Kale Oren of the Vanguard. To every ship in the fleet, this is it. The moment we've been fighting for. The Horde wants us broken, scattered, erased from the galaxy. The Alliance wants us silent, forgotten, buried under their mistakes. But we are none of those things. We are humanity. We've been exiled, hunted, underestimated, and still we stand." His words carried through the comms, filling the air with a weight that silenced the chaos. Even the bridge crew seemed to hold their breath as Kale's voice grew stronger. "They've thrown everything they have at us, ships, weapons, numbers, but they've forgotten what makes us strong. It's not the steel of our hulls or the power of our engines. It's us, our ingenuity, our resilience, our refusal to give up. Today, we don't just fight for survival. We fight to remind them who we are." The comms erupted with affirmations from across the fleet, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of determination. Kale felt the energy shift, the spark of hope igniting into a blaze. "Lyra," Kale said, turning to her, "open a broad-spectrum channel. I want the Horde to hear this too." Lyra's brows knit together, but she complied. The hum of the broadcast relay filled the room, and Kyle stepped closer to the console. "To the Eclipser Horde," Kyle said, his tone like iron. "I know you understand me. I know you can hear this. You think we're weak. You think we'll crumble under your strength. But you're wrong. You're not the hunters here. We are." For a moment, there was only silence, but Kale felt the shift, a subtle, almost imperceptible hesitation in the Horde's advance. "Rin," Kyle called, his voice snapping the engineer to attention. "Do we still have enough power for another EMP burst?" Rin's face was pale, streaked with soot and sweat. Barely. But if we fire it, we'll lose life support for at least 30 seconds. Kale nodded. We'll survive. They won't. Kale, Aaron interjected, his tone sharp. Even if the EMP works, it won't destroy them. It'll just buy us time. Kale's eyes hardened. It'll buy us what we need. Aaron opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when he saw the resolve in Kale's expression. Instead, he nodded. Understood. Kale turned to the bridge crew. Prepare to fire on my mark. Lyra, keep monitoring the Horde's movements. If they adapt too quickly, we'll need a contingency. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as the Horde ships closed the distance. Kale could feel the weight of every life aboard the Vanguard, every voice that had placed their trust in him. He gripped the console, his heart pounding in his chest. EMP charged, Rin called out, his voice tense. Kyle's eyes locked onto the tactical display, watching as the Horde ships tightened their formation. Wait for it, he murmured. The bridge crew held their breath, the tension so thick it seemed to press against their chests. The Horde ships surged forward, their movements coordinated and deadly. Kale's gaze narrowed. Fire! The reactor pulsed, sending out a wave of electromagnetic energy that rippled through the debris field. The lights flickered, and for a heart-stopping moment, the Vanguard fell silent, its systems dead. Kale's breath caught as the tactical display went dark. Then slowly the lights returned, and the display flickered back to life. The Horde ships hung motionless in the void, their systems crippled. A cheer erupted from the bridge, but Kale's focus remained razor-sharp. Aaron, he barked, now's our chance. Hit them with everything we've got. The frigates moved with deadly precision, weaving through the debris to deliver calculated strikes. Plasma bolts tore through the Horde's hulls, explosions lighting up the darkness like 1,000 dying stars. The scent of scorched metal and ozone filled the air, sharp and acrid. Kale's heart pounded as he watched the display. The Horde ships were falling, but the cost was high. Frigates blinked out of existence, their markers replaced by cold, empty space. Each loss was a knife to Kale's chest, but he couldn't afford to falter. Finally, the last Horde ship exploded, its wreckage scattering into the void. The bridge fell silent, the weight of their victory pressing down like a tidal wave. Kale closed his eyes, his chest heaving. We did it, Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kale opened his eyes, his gaze sweeping over the battered bridge. No, he said quietly. We survived. The fight isn't over. The comms crackled, and a familiar voice came through. Captain Oren, this is the Galactic Alliance Council. We've been monitoring your battle. Kyle cut them off, his tone cold. You watched while we fought your mistake. You abandoned us when we needed you most. And now, you think we'll just fall in line? There was a long pause before the voice replied. What do you want? Kyle's jaw tightened. Recognition, respect, autonomy. Humanity will no longer be your scapegoat or your pawn. We've earned our place in this galaxy, and we'll take it, on our terms. The silence that followed was deafening, but Kale didn't wait for a response. He turned to his crew, his voice steady. Set a course for Earth. We have a fleet to rebuild. As the Vanguard turned toward home, Kale felt a strange mix of exhaustion and resolve. Humanity had been exiled, but they had built something stronger in the void, and now they were ready to take their place among the stars. Kale stared out at the vast expanse of space, a faint smile tugging at his lips. They'll remember us, he murmured, not as the exiles, but as the ones who refused to fall.